Top of the middle of the day to you, boys and girls. We're outside the shop at the bench. We're going to do a little narrative session. Throwing the disclaimers out right off the bat. Check the description area for any clarifications, qualifications, corrections. I'm going to be talking about some interesting stuff here. Originally, because I field so many questions about my interpretation of what a chain should be cutting like, and I get questions on angles, and I've looked at the stops a little bit, although some of that stuff's coming up a little bit later, although it's probably going to be sooner in the timeline of my YouTube channel because this is probably coming in afterwards. I'm in the middle of a 461 build sequence. There's the star, well, one of the stars right there. I'm trying to get that wrapped up. Then I want to switch gears into some other stuff. And so I've been pondering this concept for quite some time, kind of just now getting around to it. Anyway, in the description area, there'll be clarifications and or qualifications. Check that area out. Originally, I was kind of going to go after some chain ideas, interpretations, and I thought it's a chainsaw, and we really didn't talk about the chainsaw power end of the process. So I thought, well, maybe we should discuss the chainsaw a little bit. Originally, the chainsaw concept came out of the medical field. It was designed to help aid in childbirth, actually. Interesting concept. It was called the osteotome, I think is how you pronounce that word. I think we have a picture of it right here. I would do a Google search or maybe look on Wikipedia. They have some pretty good areas of information. The original chainsaw was used in now that word I'm going to butcher, please forgive me, it's symphysiotomy. I think that's how you say that word, symphysiotomy. Anyway, it's a procedure of childbirth, and that was the original, and I think that word's pronounced osteotome. We look at, you can see some variations of it here and some accoutrements that they were using. We have a doctor, has some kind of apparatus around his neck, it looks like, and shoulder, holding the end of it while he cranks the handle, which moves the chain around while he's cutting on some kind of a piece of bone. It was designed to cut bone. The chain itself was fashioned after a bicycle chain. Obviously, they put some teeth on it. I'm not going to spend like a bunch of time on the process because we want to talk about chain a little bit. And I did print out a bunch of this information because I didn't want to try to pull it out of the depths of my cranium. You see another picture of the concept. You see the crank handle by my thumb. It's actually kind of involved, considering this tool was developed in 1830 by a gentleman. I think he was an orthopedist, and his name was Bernard Hein. I think that's how you pronounce his last name, and he was a German doctor. Now, before that, a couple other guys out of Scotland, I guess they were Scottish doctors technically, John Aiken and James Jaffrey. So in the late 1780s, they developed kind of the precursor to this. I didn't really find any pictures necessarily. They were working on it, had a working copy, I think it was in about 1890. Mr. Hein came along and kind of refined the process in the early part of the 1800s, and then he's given credit. When we look at some of the earlier dates, not too long before that, kind of somewhat of a working model was around. So if we look at conceptually earliest practical patents, what it says right here, was granted to a gentleman named Samuel J. Benz out of San Francisco in 1905. He was going to fall some giant redwoods. First portable was developed in 1918 by a Canadian millwright, James Shand. He allowed his rights to lapse in 1830 for whatever reason, and his invention was further developed by a company which became Festo, and they are basically the precursor to Festool, and they do woodworking equipment even today. Some other people that are noteworthy in the process, it says Joseph Buford Cox and Andreas Steele, and actually Andreas Steele is pretty much famous for developing the patented, whatever, I guess he patented and developed conceptually, the first electric chainsaw back in 1926. And he also did gasoline engines. Obviously, they're known for their outdoor power equipment products, came a little bit later. He did that in 1929, essentially. And in 1927, Emil Lerp founded Dolmar, and he actually developed the world's first gasoline-powered chainsaw and mass-produced them. So Dolmar was actually in existence a couple years before the gas-powered chainsaw that came from steel. I thought that was kind of interesting. Again, this information, I'm thinking you might want to check out for yourself. I'm hopefully not butchering it up too bad, but that's kind of some of the information I found out, kind of looking at the concept. So we have a chainsaw. It's going to be some kind of a power source, obviously, that's capable of turning the chain. You have to have a mechanism to get the basically transmission of the power from the engine to the chain. Most of the time it's a centrifugal clutch. It's generally how it works. Obviously there's some gear drive chainsaws out there, but they're generally working off a centrifugal clutch. And you have to have a way to lubricate the chain. That's pretty important in the process. Obviously you have to have a way to mount the bar to the block of the chainsaw so everything works appropriately. Spent a long time in development. I don't know, I was unaware until I actually started doing some research on where the chainsaws first came from, what the story was on a personal level. And speaking of chainsaws, we got to give an honorable mention out to my buddy Dave over in Ireland. His YouTube channel, since I'm going to plug him right now, Out in the Wood, all run together, all lowercase. Wood is singular. Out in the Wood. He's one of 25 gentlemen, I believe, in that country that fell timber on a pretty regular basis. So in the entire country, there's not that many guys doing that kind of work. This is his 357. I've been holding it for ransom for quite some time, and he's finally gonna get to see it. This is one of the two 357 big bore projects that I did back in 2005. I used one for felling timber with a 28, which is what we see here, and they move right along. At that point, we've watched this particular saw kind of winning against some of the new and improved quote-unquote smog saws of the day, which they have a metered air leak, and they have a lot of horsepower depending on which saws you're talking about. They don't necessarily have a lot of low end depending on which saw you're talking about. This is kind of an old school situation with a big bore job. So, but it's a pretty cherry little unit actually. I picked it up from a homeowner that I know. He just cut some firewood with it. That's the life of that saw. So we're getting ready to send it across the pond, and I'm hopeful he's going to be super well pleased. I'm going to do the torque tweak to this saw as well, and we're going to test it and see how it runs. I'm just kind of curious, but we kind of segued off. Anyway, take a moment if you have some extra time, check out his channel, and you get to see what happens over in Ireland. Okay, so back on track. We have pumpkin tea and snow in the mountains at this time. And so if we get down to like the concept of the chainsaw and the chain, we're spinning it around at a very high rate of speed, obviously. 100 miles an hour, thereabouts, depending on which saw, which drive sprocket you're running, and also I guess, how high the RPMs are going. That's going to affect how fast the chain is going around. So, but 100 miles an hour isn't necessarily uncommon. So they're moving right along. And they are kind of like conceptually what you'd see on a bicycle, sans the teeth. The rest of the process is real similar to conceptually a bicycle chain, except we have the drivers are a part of the chain instead of the sprocket. It's inverted that way, but very similar to a bicycle chain. And if you look at the concept of a chain, there are 4 angles. You think I run full chisel chain, I don't run semi-chisel, I don't run round chain, I run full chisel. So essentially what it means is the tooth is square. There's no rounded part to the side of the tooth. And if you're in conditions that are 99% wood with a little bit of silica, maybe that's the tree's pulled up through, or an occasional rock. I've found rocks inside of fir trees myself personally, so sometimes I'll have a dirt pocket in there. Madrone, I found a rock like this one time. It was 3 feet off the ground in the back. So sometimes trees will pull up debris. A lot of times the silica content in the tree itself will make the trees a lot harder. You'll see sparks fly off of your chain. That's probably a round chain type application where there's a high silica content. Live oaks are famous for that. They pull a lot of material, a lot of the silica out of the ground and basically have it in the fibers of the tree. Your chain, you can see sparks flying when you cut real early in the mornings. Anyway, if you look at a chain, there's the 2 angles that we're talking about. It's basically a 90. Not quite a 90, but it's basically a 90. They're tapered a little bit on the sides, but not really much. There's 4 angles that we're actually going to consider on a chain like this. There's the top plate angle, which when you're looking down on the chain, it runs off at a little bit of a diagonal, comes back. There's certain angles that people run their chains at. There's a line right here. I think that you can see that. At least I hope you can see the line right there. Maybe not. So anyway, so if we look at the teeth, we look at the top plate angle, and then there's an inside top plate angle, and it is basically this kind of situation here. And we look at the side plate angle like we're looking at the chain from the side, and it's canted like this somewhat. And there's an inside top plate angle, which is this way. So with a chisel tooth, there's 4 angles. Now if you're round filing, conceptually you're dealing with this 4 angles, but the teeth are shaped different and nothing's quite as stark because of the rounded shape that the file puts into the tooth. Now they make round ground chisel chains, so you can round file this chain, and they make just plain old round chain themselves. We're going to get into looking at some of that later. I don't have enough time in this session. We're going to talk about some of this other stuff. So the other part that we're looking at is the depth gauge, or the raker, or the rider, or the stop. Now technically it's a depth gauge, but it actually does do a raker component to the process. If you think about what's happening, you get the distance from the top of the stop. There's 4 names that I've heard these referred to: stops, rakers, riders, depth gauges. Stop and depth gauge would basically denote the same concept. Raker, you're helping to pull the chips out, evacuate the chips from the kerf. The distance from the top of the depth gauge to the top of the tooth is how much depth you get. Now I run my chains 40 to 60 pretty regularly. I don't run them much higher than that because the chain just kind of doesn't really dig in very well. And when you have a saw that has more power, you can run your stops down further and it'll still pull that amount of bite that the teeth are taking out of the log. So we kind of covered that part of the equation. These are called drivers, and they come in different pitches, distances. 3/8, 325, 404, those are pretty common in the chainsaw world. There's some other variations. Harvesters use a mechanical method of cutting off the end of the stumps. Hot saws have a big rotating, massively huge weighted, I think they're 1,200 pounds, a big piece of circular steel on the end of a shaft, and it has teeth in the end that are bolted on, and they spin that at a pretty high rate of speed. That cuts them off. There are saws that are driven hydraulically that have chains on them, but generally those chains are much bigger. They're bigger, heavy-duty, pitch, everything's bigger. So if you talk about the drivers, they come in for most chainsaws. I guess the 043 is kind of becoming a thing for the little mini pruning saws, but generally you're talking 50 gauge and 58 gauge and 63 gauge. That's generally how thick the driver is. So with that concept, we're talking about pitch, and we're talking about gauge is the width, pitch is the spacing. Okay, so we kind of covered some of that stuff. I don't really want to get into the angles too heavily in this session. I just want to talk about some of the overview basic stuff. I'll probably air this in reverse order. In other words, do the first part of it first. A lot of times I like to do the last video in the sequence first, and so they come out right in the timeline, but probably won't be doing that on this session. Anyway, one thing that you have to consider from a maintenance aspect is your rim. You don't want to let your rim go so long that your drivers end up touching into the bottom, well, the bottom side, go through the bottom side of the rim, touch the top side of the drum. So if we take the clutch cover off the 462, what I'm talking about is you'll end up getting wear right here. I'm thinking that you can see the shininess. So as the chain is spinning, it will wear, and I've seen saws come into my shop where they have worn so much that the pointy part of the driver is actually touching on the inside, and it's touching the shaft of the drum. So there is a maintenance component to your rim. Me personally, I would generally get about 3 or 4 chains and a new bar. By the time those chains are worn out, you're definitely ready to replace the sprocket. But you've cut quite a few million board feet at that point in time, so they've earned their money. If we get back on track for a second, one of the things that's really important to think about when you're dealing with a saw chain, speed is important. The faster it spins, the better it cuts. That's just the way it works. And there's some other dynamics associated with that process as well. We're going to touch on that. I'm going to pause for a second and start over. There's a certain amount of tension that's required for this chain to function properly. Now, not everybody runs their chain at the same tension. I personally run my chains tight. Pretty tight. And the reason I run my chains pretty tight is because if you run your chains loose, now obviously this is an exaggeration, what happens is your teeth will have a tendency to heel back. Now, this is obviously for theatrics. We would never see your chain this loose, I would hope. This is excessive. You're in danger of having it come off and cut your leg or at least your pants. So you want to keep them tight, tighter than that at the very minimum. We'll talk about that in a second. So what happens when your chain is loose is it heels back on the back side of the tooth and the back side of the strap. Now what happens is it changes the angles of the cutting surfaces that your teeth are making contact with the kerf. So the wood in the kerf technically. And it's going to cut slower because your angles are basically set up, well at least mine are, to run based on a perpendicular concept line of the bar. So I'm going to assume that my chain's tight enough that it's going to stay relatively perpendicular as it goes around the guide bar. The other thing that you have to think about is the amount of parasitic drag that you're going to get off of the wood as your teeth are changing the way they make contact as you go back. Now I personally, I don't know if this is a trade secret, top secret, whatever, it's pretty common knowledge, maybe it's not, I don't know. My stops are not flat. My stops are beveled. And my stops are beveled so that when they make contact with the wood, it's a gradual kind of a situation. And it's a lot to do with when you go around the tip and you're making contact with that wood out there. It's more gradual. It's more gentle, if you will, the way it's making contact. And so the rub factor, I call it, is going to be a little less. So back on track, if your chain is loose and your teeth are messed up and they're sitting back, heeling I call it, heeling back on the rails, which the rails are this part of the guide bar, you got a different dynamic happening and there's more rub happening as far as I can tell. So two things are happening. You're getting more parasitic drag, more rub, and your teeth are not cutting like they're supposed to be. So I run my chains relatively tight. Now, I've never really lost a lot of crank bearings on the drive side. I mean, I've lost a few over the years, but we're talking millions of board feet cut over a long time. I started falling timber professionally in 1981. Long time ago. I fell my first tree in 1976, the summer before I went to 9th grade. The loader operator needed about a 2-foot fir taken out so we could continue to turn around and load trucks properly. And so I took the tree out, hand filed with a round file back then. Home Light model XL12 with a 28-inch bar, that was it. Alright, so we covered a little bit of history. So I've been around the block a little bit on falling timber and worked way down south in California like I could see Mexico easily. I don't know if I could do anything else, but I could see it. And in the Sierras, out on the coast, in Washington State, and along with being in Oregon. So anyway, I run my chains so that with 2 fingers I can just get the bottom of the driver to clear the top of the rail. And it's tight. Now, I also make sure that my bar is in the up position when I tighten the bar nuts. And one thing that's super important to keep in your mind, or in the back of your mind, when you tighten up your bar nuts, your chain will actually get tighter. I don't know if a lot of people know that, but your bar isn't mated up with the block of the saw perfectly when it's loose, and when you tighten everything up, it actually will make the chain become tighter, which now we can tell. So I run my chains relatively tight, and the reason I run them relatively tight is to keep the angles on the teeth in the right position. Now, you're probably going to get a little more parasitic drag on the rails. Inside the rails, you're going to try to run your oiler wide open so that you have a cushion of oil, a thin cushion of oil film in between the side of the drivers and the inside of the rails. It's going to help keep your chain running a little cooler. So the more oil you have going on the process, the cooler it'll run. It's not a ton, but it's a little cooler. It's going to help with the parasitic drag factor. You're going to have a little bit less of it the more oil you run. And your chain is going to last a little bit longer in addition to your guide bar, because you're basically lubricating the process, and your chain's going to cut better. So it's kind of important, the oiler working well, doing its job. I run them wide open, but I run a little bit longer bars on the saws. What you want to do is make sure that when you have the saw ready to go like this, and you have to warm it up, obviously make sure it's good and warm, but you want a little bit of oil slinging off the end of the tip when the thing gets oiled up nicely. So we kind of went down the lubrication aspect. I mentioned I haven't really had a lot of problems with bearings, but I do know that I have to replace the sprocket probably a little bit more often. I don't know. I don't run my chains loose ever, so I don't know if it's less often with a loose chain or not. I just know that you have to keep an eye on that thing and replace it every once in a while. Especially if you put a new chain on, you want to definitely do a new sprocket. So one of the things we have to consider in this process, or maybe another one, is if you look at the chain and the parasitic drag concept, a bar that is 16 inches long will suck up about a half of a horsepower. So that's a lot of horsepower lost in a little short bar. So the longer the bar you run, the more horsepower you're going to lose from the parasitic drag concept. Again, another reason why we want to run the oiler at maximum. I kind of got off of that a little bit. You're going to be better off just running a good quality bar oil in the process as well. That'll help a little bit. Another thing that needs to be considered in this process when we're talking about the depth gauges or the stops is the elevation plays a crucial role in the function of the process. Now, what I look for whenever I go into a new strip, I try to find a piece, a limb preferably 4 to 6 inches, somewhere in the process. That's assuming that I've been there already and I have a new chain. And so I'm trying to get my stops dialed into the right place on a new chain. Not that the first day I show up there looking around for a limb, because they're still in the trees that are standing. So we're going to make the assumption that we've been there for somewhat of a time period. When we have a chain and we're unclear, what are we looking for? How should it respond? What I look for personally is a slight forward pull on the handlebar and the pistol grip. So if we find, after we've cut down a tree, in the bowl up in the top is not necessarily a good representation, because that wood is much softer than what you see at the base of the tree generally. What we're looking for is something with a little more hardness to it, so maybe cutting through a knot section in the top, that'd be a little bit more representative of what the wood of the butt of the tree or the stump of the tree is going to behave like. But essentially, if I can find a 4 or 6 inch knot, I'm pretty happy with it. If not, I'm cutting down through where I've taken a limb or two off in the bowl. And what I want, again, is a slight forward pull. I should be able to handle it with one hand on the pistol grip. I should not have to push at all. The chain should feed itself, and the tip of the saw should go down through the cut. Now, it shouldn't be like aggressive, like it's trying to rip the saw out of your hands, because once you get a hold of the full complement of the teeth in the bowl of the tree at the base, you're going to have problems with a lot of chatter. And so you want smoothness, but you want fast smoothness. That's what I've been searching for my entire career. I'm continually refining the process. So basically, I'll take a new chain into my strip. I'll have some kind of an idea based on my other chains where I can take the stops to. I might, sometimes if you're cutting on super hardwood, I might not do anything to that chain. I'll just check it out when the stops are brand new condition. And then I adjust from there. Whether you take 2 or 4 or 6 whacks with a new file is kind of dependent on how the chain responds to the particular area you're working in. And I check that out on site personally. And then I adjust my stops accordingly and get them so they'll basically feed by themselves but be smooth. So that's kind of my interpretation or my method on dealing with the elevation of the stops. If we want to talk about some of the dynamics that are happening when the chain's actually supposed to be cutting, people ask me what chains I'm running. Sometimes I'm running semi-skip, which we see here. Sometimes I'm running full skip. Sometimes I'm running full comp. I run full comp probably the most. The reason I run full comp is because it cuts smoother and it doesn't get wood dull as quickly as a full skip chain. I don't know where the information comes from that you can't run full comp chain on a bar longer than 20 inches, but I've seen where people ask, somebody somewhere said something that you're not supposed to. I have never found that to be an issue necessarily. I do not run full comp above a long 36-inch bar. Maybe that's not true. I've got a 38 that has some comp chain on it. So a 38 would be 125 drivers or something like that. I don't run comp on a 42 though. Once we get up to that length of bar, I'm running a full skip chain. A lot of it has to do with the fact that they're a pain to sharpen, that many teeth. So, but I run comp mostly because I think they cut better. They're definitely limb and buck a little bit better. I can get them to do pretty good on the stump. If we think about what's happening with the teeth, according to people with high-speed photography, the chain doing its thing, every third tooth is what's actually making contact and cutting. So that's probably a tidbit that you didn't really hear before. It's not something that I've ever, well, I've known it for a long, long time actually, but it's not something that's just common knowledge. So back on the fact that if our teeth are, if we're running a loose chain, our teeth aren't working right, the whole process isn't working right. Now, your depth gauges or stops, they're also going to be augering out spent chips from the tooth in front of it. Now, what I find when I'm running full comp, especially when it's brand new, you got to be a little bit careful because you can wood up because it's actually getting too much wood to come out at once. So that's kind of an interesting process. Out on the Redwood Coast, they get through the bark in the swell time in the spring. It's a little bit better application with full comp than full skip, I found personally. Another reason why I run full comp. So if we go back to the concept of high-speed photography, watching as the teeth are going around, every third tooth is what's doing its thing. That's on a comp chain as far as I know. That's an interesting dynamic that's happening in there. So the other teeth are what's dragging the spent chips out, right? One other thing we need to consider when your chain is loose is, and your teeth are healed back, you're going to have more of an opportunity to be getting crap sucked underneath, because as it goes around the sprocket, there's a whip factor that happens, and the centripetal force obviously is vectored off, and your chain, it's trying to throw your chain off. There's going to be a bigger gap in between your sprocket and the rails of your bar. That's going to let more crap get in your rails. That's my hypothesis. I don't know how to prove that, but that's what I think. Another reason why you want to run your chain relatively tight. Now, if we look at a bar and we look at the rails, you can see they're kind of hammered right here, and I run my chains pretty tight. They're a little mushroomed. So what happens is the chain comes around, it whips around, it's basically the centripetal force is making it go up, and then it's rolling around, and then it's making contact. Now obviously that's an exaggeration. That's kind of what's happening. So you get that mushroom effect out at the heel of your bar. So we talked about quite a bit of stuff except angles and what they're doing. I didn't really want to go down that road because that's a whole nother can of worms. That's going to require some time. I just kind of wanted to cover where chainsaws came from, which I thought was interesting on a personal level. I wanted to talk about some overview aspects of a saw chain. I don't think that I really wanted to go any further with this session at this point. We'll get into some of the other things I do and why I do them, I guess, at this point. And we'll have to meet up again in the Faller's Corner here for, I don't even know what to name this process. I've been kind of vacillating on a few things to title this process. So yeah. Anyway, kind of my thoughts on some basic stuff, overview things, and there you go. I hope that you took a nugget or two away from this process. I'm super hopeful that there's been something gleaned from this session, and it'll help the process for you out there. We'll get into the rest of it at another point in time, but thanks for watching this session. I hope you have a blessed day wherever you might be on God's green earth.